Hello, all of my good friends there in California, George and the others, and also those who are watching this live from around the world. I'm so sorry I can't be there in person with you. I have many of the categories of COVID right now, and that's why I'm not even permitted to get on a plane. So that's why I could not make it out there to California. Really wish I could have been there. Enjoyed watching the testimonies earlier this evening, and certainly enjoyed also the panel. I was supposed to have been on that panel. I'm sorry I didn't make it, but I love the four of you who were there, and I agree with everything you've said. You did an excellent job. God bless you. Now, George has asked me to talk about the Taliban, mainly because of tomorrow. Tomorrow is the 20th anniversary of the atrocities that happened in 9/11, 2001, 20 years ago. And to understand and unpack what's happened in the last 20 years and what's happening now and what's been happening in the last few weeks, George wanted me to give some background to these Taliban, where they came from, whether or not they are radicals or not, and really what their agenda is, what their history is, and what should we expect. And do we have a solution? Do we have something that we can work towards? Is there something that we as Christians can do concerning not just the Taliban, but also the radicals who are coming this direction, who are coming to the West, and we're going to have to deal with? This is the group that I love the most, mainly because I have been involved with the radicals. This has been my area of expertise, and it's been my love and joy, my remit for the last, I've been working with Muslims for 40 years, but that's certainly the last 30 years. And so that's why I want to talk about the Taliban. Also because I grew up in that part of the world. I grew up in India, not too far away, just next to Pakistan. And so I know a good bit about it. I know their history. And also, I have been following them for many years. So let's get right into it. I'm going to share my PowerPoint, and then we'll go right into the PowerPoint. This is, I call this T for the Taliban. It's taken from a video that I put up about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and it got banned on Facebook because it was too controversial for Facebook. So if it's too controversial for Facebook, it'll probably be somewhat controversial for some of you who are going to watch. But let's go ahead and let's unpack it, because we need to find out who these people are, what they've been doing, and why is it everybody is concerned, or why is it people are upset. Well, you have seen the pictures of the Taliban as they've come in. I don't think any of these are surprising to you. Are they really radical Muslims, though? Do they fit the category of radical Islam? Well, defining radical Islam. Let's go ahead and define it, because in order to know whether they do, we need to see what the Muslims have been saying. Ayatollah Khomeini, you know him from Iran. He said this back in 1989, that all adult males must prepare themselves for the conquest of other countries so that Islam is obeyed in every country in the world. Islam wants to conquer the whole world. Those who are against war are witless. Islam says, kill all the unbelievers, put them to the sword, and scatter their enemies, or their armies, kill in the service of Allah. So that's one definition that we have of radical Islam. Here's another one by Amir Taheri, the Iranian author based in Europe, chairman of Gatestone Institute. He says, Islam says whatever good there is exists thanks to the sword, in the shadow of the sword. People cannot be made obedient except with the sword. The sword is the key to paradise. There are hundreds of Psalms and Hadith, that's the sayings of the Prophet, urging Muslims to value war and to fight. Well, let's go to Turkey. Let's look and see what Recep Tayyip Erdogan, what does he say? And he talks about this idea of moderate Islam. And he was asked on TV about this. And his response is, there is no moderate or immoderate Islam. Islam is Islam, and that's it. So obviously, everybody seems to be saying the same thing. Let's go to possibly one of the greatest moderates, Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who is there in Al Jazeera television. He is the scholar who comes on in the evenings, and he's the one that unpacks the Quran. He's the one that exegetes it. Certainly, he would have a definition. And he was asked this back in 2004, a year to the day of the bombings that we had in 2005 in London. He was there at Heathrow Airport, and he was asked, what is radical versus moderate Islam? And was asked, is there such a thing as radical Islam? Can they have suicide bombers? And he, right there at Heathrow Airport on July 7th, said, yes, suicide bombers are perfectly legitimate. And then he went on to say that for Muslims, men can beat their wives, quoting chapter 4, verse 34. And then he said that for homosexuals, they must be killed. Now, he wasn't even asked that question. He just introduced it. So if this is the most moderate voice that's on Al Jazeera television every night, and that defines Islam, then I would say that's pretty radical. Unfortunately, those who invited him to Heathrow Airport didn't realize who he was or where he came from. They had no idea that he was a student of Sayyid Qutb and Ayman Zawahiri. Sayyid Qutb of the Muslim Brotherhood, Ayman Zawahiri, who is still alive today, who is one of the leaders, one of the founders of Qaeda and part of the Muslim Brotherhood before that. So let's go on and let's ask what some of my friends, Sheikh Omar Bakri Muhammad and Anjum Chowdhury, two fellows that I've debated and I've had years of experience with, still do follow Anjum Chowdhury. Sheikh Omar Bakri Muhammad, we're not even sure is alive anymore, but they're in Britain. I used to debate these guys and their followers, 2,000 of whom went and joined ISIS in 2014 and 2015. And they would say there is a struggle between the people of Shaitan, that would be people like Cameron, Killian Project, and anybody else that's Western, and those of Allah, or the Muslims. And Allah is on our side, so we will win. The speech, he said, by Mr. Cameron, who was our prime minister at that time, was an attack against Muslims, not extremists. He wants Muslims to give up the idea of Khilafah and the Sharia and jihad. There is no Islam without ruling by that which Allah has revealed, the Khilafah, the Islamic State, and removing obstacles in the way of implementing the Sharia. So even in Britain, these are both British-based Muslims, highly controversial, obviously, but they do represent a good portion of Muslims in Britain. And so you have these two responses. On one side, you have the traditionalists, the Islamicists, like Anjum Chowdhury I just quoted. On the other side, you get the almost extreme opposite, Irshad Manji out of Canada, who is actually a lesbian and is also a self-proclaimed imam in her own life. Right, and she has written this Allah, Liberty, and Love, a very, not at all traditional view, a very westernized, not even moderate, I would say very liberal view of Islam. This tug of war that's going on in Islam right now, the traditionalists on the right and the modernists on the left. The Anjum Chowdhury's over here who want to hold on to 1,400 years of tradition. They seek to apply and impose this, the Quran, the Hadith, the Sirah, the Tafsir, the standard Islamic narrative, as we call it, including the Tariq and the Sharia for today. And then you have the modernists over here who are seek to find the spirit of Islam in these texts within rejecting many of them, saying they're no longer applicable today, choosing some, and resurrecting the art of ijtihad, interpretation, believing Islam is a viable modernized entity for today. So they are both using the text, but they're using it two different ways. The traditionalists read it and apply it literalistically. The modernists, on the other side, try to sanitize it for the Western mindset. The Irshad Manjis on one side, the Anjum Chowdhury's on the other. Let's look at the text and let's see how you can do that. Well, when you look at the text, and this is something I've always asked moderate Muslims or those on the left, I asked them, hold on a minute. If you believe radical Islam that's over here on the right, does not follow the text, where are these verses you're talking about, such as verses on peace? And they always start with chapter 2, verse 256, for there is no compulsion in religion. I remember I was in the House of Lords when this was brought up by the Lord Ahmed, who was the senior Muslim lord at that time. And he came into the room. We were in there. We were discussing these Islamic courts. We were trying to shut down these Islamic courts. And he put his books down, turned to us in the gallery there. And he says, what's your problem? Islam is a religion of peace. For there is no compulsion in religion. And I raised my hand and I asked Lord Ahmed, do you know where that comes from? He says, no, I'm not a Jew. I'm not an Islam Quranist. I just know that it says that it's somewhere in the Quran. I said, that's in chapter 2, verse 256. I said, have you read the rest of the verse and have you read the one that follows it? Because if you look at the entire context of that verse, you will see that this is for those who reject Allah and Muhammad, for great will be their retribution, for they will be in hellfire. I said, now is there no retribution? Is there no compulsion? There is all kinds of compulsion. And he jumped over to chapter 109, verse 1-6. Unto you your religion, and unto me my religion. As if that was the one verse that he could hang on to. He then went on to chapter 2, verse 190, though he didn't know the context. And I said, where it says, those who fight you do not transgress limits. And I said, do you know the context of that verse? He says, no, again, I told you I'm not a Quranist. I said, why don't you read the rest of the verse? Because then it says, and slay them wherever you catch them and fight them. And until they prevail, no faith, no more faith in Allah. I said, if that's what you're talking about, then I'm already dead. How can you not have any, how can you have transgress any limits? I'm dead, I'm killed. Don't use that verse, I said. And I remember other Muslims have come up with these verses. And I've always said, look and ask what part of the Quran they belong to. And in almost every case, these supposed peaceful verses turn out not to be peaceful. And they are also in the wrong part of the Quran, because we have two different sections of the Quran. You have, if you look at the Quran, the very beginning part is what we know as Medina, and the second part would be Mecca. And the Medina are the longer verses that are chapters, the second are the shorter chapters. Now, there is a problem, because there's almost two completely different contexts when you look at the two sections of the Quran, and they do not at all fit together. There is an enormous amount of contradiction after contradiction. All the violent verses are in the first part, and all the supposed peaceful verses are in the second part. Well, the way to eradicate that is to go to Surah 2, Ayah 106, and Surah 16, Ayah 101. When you look at these two verses, and it says, that which we give something better. So mansuk versus nasik, which means there is an abrogation. The later, which is the Medinans, abrogates the earlier, which is Meccan, and all the peaceful verses are in the Meccan surahs. All the violent ones are in the Medina, which abrogate the peaceful verses. Therein is the problem. In chapter 5, verse 32, and this is probably this is the favorite verse of almost all the liberals and the moderate Muslims. And it comes from this idea that the children of Israel, it says that if anyone killed a person in retaliation of murder or spread mischief in the land, it would be as if he killed all mankind. But if anyone saved a life, it would be as if he saved the life of all mankind. So you have this don't kill, save. Seemingly a very peaceful verse. And I know everybody loves to use this verse until you realize that this verse needs to follow verse 31, which talks about the blood. It talks about Cain killing Abel, and it's about the blood of Abel taken by Cain. So it's really it's nothing more than a redemption analysis on the blood of Abel, but it is for children of Israel, which Muslims are not. You have to read the next verse. That's for us, and that's for Muslims. And it says, the recompense for those who wage war against Allah and his messenger and do mischief in the land. Now, what does mischief in the land? I've asked Muslim after Muslim, the only thing they can say is, this Muslim in the land is anybody who stands against Islam, is that they should be killed or crucified, or their hands and their feet be cut off on opposite sides. Now, folks, if you're going to go to verse 32, that doesn't apply to Muslims, but 33 does, and it applies also to us. That's why I have to put the two together. You need to look at the context. It's not a very pretty context. And that's why it's so important that we do continue to use these verses and use them with Muslims, but also show people who are using them that they dare not support their arguments with those supposedly peace verses. And I've said this for almost 40 years of working with Muslims. Show me one peaceful verse that says you're to have peace with me, a Christian. You cannot find it, not in the Quran. Which suggests to me then that the radicals got it right. The radicals on the left, they're going to the Quran. So who are these radicals? Well, let's take a look and let's try to define radicalization. Do they have a true interpretation of Islam, and do they follow a divine edict? Now, the difficulty is this. Here in the West, we don't know how to define them. And we really have two different camps. So when we say who are radicals, there's one group that is very popular. It's not just becoming very popular. It's very popular in our pundits. It's very popular in our politicians. It's very popular amongst our, certainly, missionaries. I'm finding it also in our churches here in the US and also in Europe, that say that radicalism is a new phenomenon. It didn't exist prior to 1948, that it's because of the creation of the state of Israel that radical Islam really was created. And because of that, and it was exacerbated by Afghanistan and exacerbated by Iraq, but it therefore is a brand new creation. It really is something that's not even been around 100 years. That's the one group. The other group comes from the position that radical Islam is not new, and that it's very old. In fact, it has existed from the time that Islam began. And I would suggest the year would be 624, when the Islamic State began. So let's look at the first position. The first position, well, actually, I've just given you the first position. The radical Islam is a reaction against geopolitical circumstances. It's a reaction against the creation of Israel in 1948. It's a reaction against taking over Afghanistan in 2001, which created the Taliban, and that's where Al-Qaeda then took off there, and they eradicated, well, those towers in New York, and also what they did to our economy, to say nothing of the fact what they did to us as a people. And then, of course, Iraq, exacerbated by what happened in Iraq with Saddam Hussein, which all three are political problems. If you look at them, none of these are theological, they're political. Therefore, they need a political solution. And that's not for us as Christians, because we are not political. We separate church and state. So it's not really our problem. Radical Muslims are not our problem. I get this all the time from Christians. I get it from atheists. I get it from humanists. I get it from politicians. Anybody I meet when I say I work with radical Muslims say, what a waste of time. You can't do a thing about it. Because in order to eradicate radical Islam, you're going to have to use bombs, bullets, and cruise missiles. And you don't have anything to do with bombs, bullets, and cruise missiles. Especially me as a pacifist, I'm even further off to the right. What can the church do? Well, most people, when I talk about radical Islam, or I talk about ISIS, or Al-Qaeda, or the Taliban, or the Boko Haram, or the Al-Shabaab, or the Hizb al-Tahrir, you name it, all these different groups, they say, really, just ignore it, Jay. Don't worry about it. We can't fight it, so don't fight it. Can't throw money at it, so don't throw money at it. Try to find common ground. Find common ground with it somehow. So that's their view. I don't fall in that camp. You can tell pretty clearly that I do not fall in that camp, that the radical Islam is something new and it's all political, and therefore it's only been around for less than 100 years. I believe radical Islam goes right to the very beginning of Islam. The very beginning of Islam. You've got to go back to the 7th century. You've got to start with Muhammad himself. You need to look at his example in Medina to find out the whole foundations for Islam. You'll need to look at the caliphate that started in 624 and how he defeats the Jews in 624, 625, up until 627, dies finally in Medina in 632, again, according to the standard Islamic tradition. And then you need to go follow the 4 rightly guided killers. Look at what Abu Bakr did, Umar, Uthman, and Ali. Look at all the way up from 632 all the way up to 661. And when the Umayyad Caliphate finally comes in 61, and look and see the warfare, so the enormous amount of violence that happened from the very beginning. Start from 972, getting into the 10th century, going up into the 11th century, the ordinance of the government, of the religious positions, the Sunni Islamic political thought. Take a look at it, unpack it. Look at the 7 criteria for the caliphs, codified the political edifice. Take a look and unpack them, and you will see it is absolutely radical in its very ethos. Enforcing the jizya tax, wouldn't permit anybody who was of the dhimmi, those who were the Christians or the Jews, to build their temples or build their buildings or churches or synagogues. Then you get to really the man that would be the most radical, the one that really stands as a radical for me, and that's Ibn Taymiyyah. Ibn Taymiyyah from 1263 to 1328. If you want to find how to define an Islam, a Muslim, in fact, when radicals talk to me, and I've spent 30 years working with the radical Muslims, what they tell me is that to find out and understand who a radical Muslim, who a foundational Muslim, because radical by definition is, well, like a radical number. It is the root. You go to the root. You go to the root of Islam. You go to the radical number. You want to go to the root of Islam, you need to start at the very beginning. But then they always point to Ibn Taymiyyah. Why? Because Ibn Taymiyyah started from the premise that in order to be a good Muslim, chapter 5, verse 111, you must follow God and you must follow his prophet. Follow God, follow the prophet. And to do that, you need to read the Quran. So therefore, you need to read the Quran, look and see what the Quran's about, and see it's all about Muhammad. Therefore, read the book, follow the man. Read the book, follow the man. The book of the man, book of the man, book of the man. This is my favorite phrase. And it's not me that created that phrase. It's actually the Muslims that helped me understand it, because that's what they say all the time, quoting Ibn Taymiyyah. Ironically, about 200 years later, Martin Luther said much the same thing. There in Germany. To be a good Christian, read the Bible and follow Jesus, the book of the man, book of the man, book of the man. So our Reformation is based on that whole principle, and yet we got it 200 years after the Muslims. They were way ahead of us on this idea. We then jump to the 1700s, and we see Ibn Taymiyyah's legacy, specifically with Muhammad ibn al-Wahhab. Al-Wahhab was from that part of Arabia. He lived in Medina. He was studying Ibn Taymiyyah's material. With him was another guy named Shah Walihullah, who you see pictured there on the right. He came from India, way over in the east, and he had come up to Medina to study Ibn Taymiyyah as well. So the two of them were there in Medina, in the central part of the Hijaz, what we know to the Hijaz, and they were looking at Ibn Taymiyyah's message, so that Wahab stayed there, amalgamated himself with the Saud family, the Ibn Saud family. The Ibn Saud family then took over and eradicated all their competition there in the Arabian Peninsula, and they then created the Saudi Arabia that we have today, giving their name to the country. They needed, obviously, religious legitimacy, and that's why they went to Wahab and asked him to be their theologian. And so bringing the church, or you might say bringing the mosque and the state together, they then amalgamated themselves as the politicians and Wahab as the theological foundations for their patronage and for their political office. Shah Walihullah took this teaching and went back to India, and it was his talibés, or his students, that's what talibés mean, who then confronted the British, who then moved them off to the west of North India, up into what is today Pakistan in the north and western frontier. Now, let's jump to the 20th century. From the 1700s, let's go to the 1900s. And I want to look at two men in specifically, those that you see pictured there, because these are the radicals who then really pulled up there and made a huge influence there in the Indian subcontinent, which makes up most Muslims today. Today, if you look at Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh, you look at the Muslims that are there, the number of Muslims you're talking about are roughly 600 million out of 1.5 billion. There's no other group that's that large. The entire Arab contingent, Arab-speaking Muslim contingent, only makes up about 300, maybe less than that, 280 million. And here you have 600 to 650 million coming out of the Indian subcontinent. And the two names I'm going to look at are Muhammad Ilyas al-Kandhlawi, because in the 20th century, these two men, Kandhlawi and Maududi, Abdul Allah Maududi, were the two strongest proponents of Islamic radicalism. Muhammad Ilyas Kandhlawi created the group called the Tablighi Jamaat. I don't know if any of you have heard of that. It's a very well-known group. It started in 1926, and his whole emphasis was to bring people back to the Book of the Man, taking them back to the Quran, modeled by Muhammad. Now, they have grown and grown in the last 100 years, and so now they are in about 120 countries. They have a membership of 80 million. That is the largest radical group I know anywhere in the world. I don't know of any other radical group that numbers that much. And yet most of you who are listening to me have never heard of this group. These are the guys and gals I have to work with, because they are from the Indian subcontinent. They dominate Islamic theology and politics in the UK, in Britain, where I spent 25 years up until 2017. And so I've had to engage with these talibs, the students, and the members of the Tablighi Jamaat. The other man is Abdul Maududi, who was from Deoband. Deoband is in northern India. I used to go through Deoband on my way to visit my parents on the train, and then we would stop, and there would be these madrasas on either side of the railway tracks. And so Maududi was the big leader there, and the Deobandi, the whole Deobandi radical ideals came out of his schools in 1947. That he left India and went over to Pakistan in the West, and he started the Jamaat-e-Islami, which are all based on the Deobandi movement that came out of Deoband there in India. Now, those madrasas have been growing and growing and growing since the last century. Today, they are all over northwestern Pakistan, and they are primarily in the Pashtun areas. The Pashtun, I'm going to be talking about them a little later. They are the ones that make up the Taliban, because these madrasas are pouring out these students, and these students are known as talibés. And the talibé then became the Taliban. The Taliban, how many are we talking about? Well, according to the latest statistics, anywhere from 1.7 million of these students are being graduated every year. That's a large number. So you've got to pay attention to these groups. They're just so huge. We're talking about millions, not just tens of thousands. But they're all in the Indian subcontinent. What about over there in Middle East? Well, in Middle East, you need to go back at the same time period in the 20th century. You need to go back to Egypt. And you need to go back to Hassan al-Banna. You can see him pictured there, who started the Muslim Brotherhood. He was killed in 1948. And his favorite recruit and student was Said Qutb, hugely influential. Said Qutb could memorize this book here, the Quran. He memorized it by the time he was 10 years old, which showed the prodigy of who we're talking about. And there in 1966, he was then killed by Gamal Nasser. He had been in prison for 10 years, from 56 to 1966. While in prison for those 10 years, he wrote two pivotal books, In the Shade of the Quran that you see there, and Milestones. I have Milestones right back here. But it is those books that I see that almost all my radical friends say you must read, because if to understand us, you need to read those books, because those are like the Mein Kampf, you might say, of Islamic radicalism today in the 20th century. He just took this book and he exegeted it, showed verse by verse how you apply it for the 20th century, not for the 7th century. He brought that which was written in the 8th and 9th century, and he brought it into the 20th century. And that's why he was so dangerous, and that's why he was so influential, and that's why he finally had to be killed, became a martyr in 1966. Now, his favorite student is this man you see there behind the jail, behind the bars of his prison. Ayman Zawahiri was a medical doctor, Egyptian, was part of the Muslim Brotherhood, studied under Said Qutb. He had memorized the Quran by the time he was 15. Again, another prodigy. But he became radicalized by the Nasser and Sadat and these Egyptian pan-Arabists. Pan-Arabism starts from the premise that they want to become westernized, but they want to do better than the Westerners at their own job. And so Ayman Zawahiri was absolutely livid with this, and that's why he was put into jail. He was finally released, but he did know his scriptures and he did know his theology. He then amalgamated, or he met up with Osama bin Ladin, who you see pictured there, the two of them pictured together. And the two of them then created Al-Qaeda. What does it mean? In Arabic, it means the base. The base means really the foundations, the root. Remember, radical by definition means root. The root number, the radical number is a root number. And from while they were becoming influential, and because we know about them much more than others, because of the fact those of us who are American, you'll see in a little while why we know them better. That same time, there were other groups that were popping up all over the place. You have the Hezbollah, the Hamas, the Al-Mahajirun there in Britain, Hamas there in Palestine, Hezbollah, who were there in Lebanon, the Jamaat-e-Islami in Pakistan, the Lashkar-e-Taiba, they're also coming out of Pakistan, the Hizb ut-Tahrir that are in Egypt, Al-Shabaab, they were there in Somalia, Boko Haram in Nigeria, and then ISIS that was formed in Iraq, but then moved into Syria, and then the Taliban itself there in Afghanistan. So all these groups and all these different countries were all becoming radicalized, all based on this viewpoint coming out of Wahhabism that was created in 1700 based on Ibn Taymiyyah's material in the 1300s. Can you see? It's been around for 700 years. This radical view of going back to the Book of the Man, the Book of the Man, the Book of the Man. And all of these groups start from that premise. You always go back and read the Quran, but don't just read it figuratively, you read it literalistically, word for word. And you take whatever it says because it is divine. It is from God himself. You don't question it. You don't try to unpack it. You submit to it. You obey it. And if you know anything about a radical Muslim, they obey the Quran literalistically. And that's why almost all of these groups start from that premise. That's why they're kind of easy to understand. Meanwhile, in the 1970s and up to 2000, you had Musab al-Zarqawi, who was part of Al-Qaeda. He was sent by Ayman Zawahiri to create the Al-Qaeda branch there in Syria and Iraq. And he came across Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and was very influential in really radicalizing Baghdadi. Baghdadi has a doctorate. He's from Baghdad. That's why his name is Baghdadi. And he got a doctorate, I understand it, in Islamic theology and also in Islamic history. So he was not a floozy. This guy really knew his material. Musab Zarqawi then taught him all the manications or manifestations, and how to then use this material, and how to actually take these ideas and put them and apply them on the ground. And so that's why he got him into many of the tactics that Al-Qaeda has been using. The terrorist tactics really came from Musab al-Zarqawi. Zarqawi was then killed by a drone, a US drone, which kind of shut down Al-Qaeda after he was dead. But ISIS, of course, just grew and grew and grew. And then by 2014, they just completely took over, not just Iraq, but all of Syria, and had their headquarters there in the Raqqa. Now, what is the strategy of the radicals? Well, this is something that I used to always ask whenever I wanted to go to many of the Muslim meetings there in Britain. And I would go to as many of them as I could. And I always saw that they always repeated the same thing. Didn't matter which group I went to, didn't matter which building I was in or which meeting I was in. It always came down to these three stages of what they call da'wah, which means to invite. And what they would say was this: if you want to find out what we're to do in the West, or what we're to do in the world in the 21st century, you need to follow the Prophet's life. You need to go back to Muhammad's own life. You need to go back to his biography. And when you look and see what he did, when he moved, he was started receiving his revelations in 610 up until 622. And while he was there in Mecca from 610 to 622, he didn't have any political power. He was oppressed. And so the only thing he could do for da'wah was to write and to receive and to receive these revelations. And so that they called it the pen stage. It was the writing stage. And that's what they're doing all over the West. And you'll see them. That's what they're using the internet for. And that's why they're using radio and television and all these different social media platforms, YouTube and all the rest. That's the first stage of da'wah. When Muhammad then moved to Medina in 622, for the next 2 years, he started imposing laws and institutions. He created the Constitution of Medina. There's what Muslims are doing in Europe right now, and they're doing it in other countries in the world, like Nigeria in the north. And you're seeing this is happening in many Western countries. They're now imposing it. It's happening in Britain, putting in laws and institutions such as Islamic courts now that were finally okayed in 2007 in Britain. That's the scale, which is the scale of law. The lady who has a blindfold, and we have the scale. So they call that the scale stage, those 2 years that he was there from 622 to 624. But then in 624, when the Jews refused to accept him as their arbiter between man and God, which is the first article of the Treaty of Medina, they then started using the sword. And you have the Battle of Badr in 624. You have the Battle of Uhud in 625. You have the Battle of the Trenches in 627. So that by the end of the Battle of the Trenches, there were no Jews left in Medina. They eradicated all the Jews using the sword in the last case. And then from 624 all the way up into 632, Muhammad started using the sword right, left, and center. It was involved in 39 battle campaigns, planned another 22, 29, I think it was, on top of that. So that's the sword stage. And when I would talk to radical Muslims, they would say in the ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Boko Haram and all these different groups, the Taliban included, that they have now moved to that sword stage. You then move into this third stage of da'wah, which is their evangelism. Why the need for da'wah? Well, they would say, and they always talked about the different areas that the West is in decline. It's in decline culturally because it's lost of national identity. Most people don't even know who they are. They don't have any cultural identity anymore. They're multicultural. And when you're multicultural, it means you don't understand your own culture. And there's such a, especially in Europe, it's starting to happen here in America. We don't like America anymore. We hate America. A lot of our politicians want nothing about American ideals or history anymore. And the same thing is happening in Europe. They hate the colonial past and they just want to eradicate, even they're embarrassed by their own flags. The cultural loss of identity is part of this decline that they're looking at. Socially, look at the families, they say. Look at all the dysfunctional families you have in the West. And they have plenty of examples to show. It's all over our newspapers. More than just open up any television channel and look at the movies and the TVs, the movies, look at the sexual promiscuity in all of our films and also our music. That proves that we are morally in decline. Spiritually, especially in Europe, only 5 to 7% of the populace go to church anymore. So Christianity has basically lost its sell-by date. And then economically, well, look at capitalism. Look what capitalism does. It uses interest, it uses usury, it makes the rich richer and the poor poorer. And you can see example after example. They give all kinds of examples how the West, which is rich, has been persecuted and obliterating any hope of advancement. And that's capitalism at its worst. That's why Islam was against usury And then politically, we'll look at democracy. Democracy, by definition, is man-made. It is one man against the other. No group of people against group of people. There's nothing about God in it. Therefore, it is anathema in Islam because it is man-driven, man-made, man-instituted, man-continued, and therefore, it has nothing to do with God. And therefore, politically speaking, you must have the Sharia law. So what's their solution? If there's all this decline happening in the West, then Islam is the answer. I would get this at all the meetings I went to. Islam has an answer. Eradicate immorality, introduce Sharia law, and that will eradicate all this promiscuity. Take away usury and institute Islamic banking, which has no usury, no interest. Eradicate democracy, introduce the caliphate. Caliphate has always been better because take a look at the history. It was always perfect. As soon as Muhammad instituted the caliphate in 624, look and see what happened. He took over and he just made a huge gains. And you can see with Abbottabad, Umar, Uthman, and Ali. Just take a look at those four first caliphs, and my goodness, look and see how Islam shot up. Eradicate Western militaries and introduce the Ummah and eradicate them, and you can introduce then the Islamic State. Now, ISIS especially, you can see, just looking at some examples of where they were starting to use this sword. And you can see with ISIS in 2015, take a look at how many incidents that happened. I just put this up there just so you remember. Do you all remember in 2014, 2015, and then in 2016, all these attacks that happened, 103 in January, 71 in February, 110 in March. I've got a cough. I'm sorry. I've got it. Let me just take this sip. 153 in April, 198 in May, 233 in June, 190 in July, 145 in August, 190 in September, just in 1 year. Enormous amount of attacks. When you look at the Western versus the non-Western attacks, you can see against Westerners, not nearly as many as attacks against non-Westerners. People think it was all against us. No. Take a look. There are a huge amount of attacks in Egypt, but down below, if you look at the bottom line, Yemen and Kuwait and Turkey and Lebanon, ISIS and these radical groups actually attacked more of their own than they did of Westerners themselves. And take a look on the worldwide, the red dots, those are the places that were attacked by ISIS, or those inspired by ISIS are the ones with the circles. So you can see attacks all over the world, even including in the United States. When you look by country, I'll let you break it down. You can see that the number of countries that are there. Take a look at all the European countries, all the westernized countries, and then, of course, the other larger Indian Muslim countries. So obviously, the question we need to ask is then how important are they? Are these just isolation? Are these just a small group? Or do they actually represent a larger group? Now, back in 2015, President Obama said that radical Muslims made up only around 1% of all Muslims. Not very much, therefore. He said, we don't really have to worry about them. When I look at the UK, and I always use this because this is what I used when I was in the UK, this question was asked about the radical Muslims, Al-Qaeda, when they destroyed in 9/11, when they destroyed those two towers. 3,000 people were killed. In October, the very next month, they asked their people in Britain, how many of you support what Al-Qaeda did? And about 15% said they supported Al-Qaeda. Those who were nominal in the middle were about 70%. So they were by far the largest group. And the liberal over here on the left. So you had the radicals over here, 50%, the nominals in the middle, 70%, and over here on the left, the liberals only made it 50%. So again, very small number. More than 1%, but still a small number. They then asked in 2006 the same question. And this group that had been radical over here had grown to 43%, so over 40%. Almost half of all Muslims have been radicalized in just 5 years. And of those people, when they asked the question, do you support suicide bombers? 20% of them supported suicide bombers. And all of them wanted Sharia law to come to Britain, to the UK. By 2015, 27% of them supported the Charlie Hebdo killers. So you can see radicalism is coming to the West, whether we like it or not, and it certainly is the case there in the UK from those statistics. When they wanted to look at other populations like Turkey, Morocco, Jordan, and Pakistan, they asked this in 2004. So this is 3 years after the Taliban, or I'm sorry, Al-Qaeda destroyed the towers there in New York. And they found out in Turkey, 31% of them supported what had happened in 2001. In Morocco is 45%. 31 in Turkey, 45% in Morocco. Jordan, it was 55%. In Pakistan, 65%. That's hugely troubling because at that time, there are 80 million out of 140 million people in Pakistan at that time. Today, now, it's almost approaching 200 million. So you can see these are troubling statistics because this shows that radicalization in those countries, when they were asked, is not just 1%, like Obama suggested. Now, looking at the numbers, this was the Clarion project that was done in 2015. So we're talking about 6 years ago. They wanted to unpack these statistics a little bit more. And so though they found that 99.9% of Muslims in the West claimed to be peaceful, Muslims at that time in 2015 made about 1.6 billion. Yet 40,000 to 200,000 were members of ISIS, 30,000 were members of Hamas, 50,000 were members of Hezbollah, 100,000 were members of Qaeda and their affiliates, 20 to 100,000 were members of IRCG, which is the Al-Quds force there in the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, 60 to 100,000 were Taliban soldiers in Afghanistan. And 2,000 young British Muslims, all who were sent by Anjem Choudhury and Sheikh Omar Bakri Muhammad, my good friends, who joined ISIS. This just there in Britain. Now, just looking at those numbers, does that make up 1%? Or let's look at this. How do you define radicalism? Pew International did this Clarion project and these statistics, and they wanted to find out how you would define it. So they looked at the word, the idea of apostasy, that you kill those who leave Islam. They wanted to see if, since that's a radical, that would be a radical injunction. They found that in Afghanistan, almost 80% believed that apostates should be killed. In Egypt, it was 86%, Jordan, 82%, Pakistan, 76%, Malaysia, 62%, and that 27% of all Muslims believe that apostates from Islam should be killed worldwide. That's roughly 237 million Muslims believe that apostates from Islam, those who leave Islam, should be killed. Does that constitute 1%? Not at all. Honor killings, when your child does something wrong and you kill her or him. 37% of all Muslims believe that those who dishonor a family should be killed. And that's found in chapter 18 of the Quran. That represents 345 million of all Muslims believe honor killings are justified. Is that just 1%? What about suicide bombings? Looking here just in the West, they found that amongst French Muslims between 18 and 29 years old believe 42% of them, that's almost half of them, believe that suicide bombings are justified. Amongst British Muslims, again, in the same age group, 35% of them believed that they were justified. In America, between that same age group, 26% of them believed that suicide bombings were justified. Sharia and Hudud laws, 53% of all Muslims in the West were in favor of Sharia law. 22% of all Muslims in the West were in favor of whippings and amputations. That's over half of all Muslims in the West. This is in the West, folks. I'm not talking about Muslims living in the Muslim countries. These are Muslims living in Europe and Australia and the United States. And 51% of all Muslims in the West are in favor of stoning adulterers. Goodness sakes. Sharia law, I can understand, but whippings and amputations, well, you just look at the Quran again. Whippings, that's in chapter 24, verse 2 of the Quran. Amputation, that's in chapter 5, verse 38 of the Quran. Stoning adulterers, that's in also chapter 24, verse 2. So that you can see they're following the Quran. And that's over half of all the populations of Muslims living in the West do believe in these hudud, Sharia law, very penalizing laws. That makes up 281 million worldwide would be in favor of these. Is that 1%? Now, why then this growth of radicalism? Why is it that just in the UK from 15%, it went all the way up to 43% in just 5 years? What was behind this growth in radicalism? To understand the growth, we need to go to the foundations of radicalism. We need to go to the two authorities for every Muslim, and there are two sources. One is the scripture, the Quran, and the other one is Muhammad, the Book of the Man. I've said this already. You know where I'm going to go with this. When you look at the book, I've already gone through the verses on the peace verses, and I haven't really had a chance to go into the violent verses because there's so many of them. In fact, there's so many. Just take a look, 149 violent verses. Notice the sword verses. Some of you may know these. I don't have time to get into them because we don't have that time today, but let's go ahead. And so just show you the Quran is full of violent verses. Enormous number one of them. How should these verses be exegeted? Well, to understand any verse, to exegete any verse, you always go back to the author. No, we don't have the author for the Quran, so therefore we need to go to the model of the Quran, and the model would be Muhammad himself. And you need to go to his biography, the Siratul Rasulullah, written by Ibn Hisham. You need to go to his sayings, the Hadith, written by Al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, Ibn Dawud, and others. You need to go to the Maghazi rates, the Maghazi documents, written by Al-Waqidi, who was writing it in the 9th century as well. And what you find is that he fought 29 battles himself and planned another 39 on top of that. So 29 battles he fought himself personally and then planned another 39. So you can see his whole life after 624, from 624 to 632, that's that 8-year period. He fought all these battles. So if that's his example, then you can understand why those who come under his jurisdiction, which means all Muslims, look and see what he did to the Jews. You can see why they would do that, because look what he did to the Jews in 624 after the Battle of Balda. He threw out the Banu Qanuqa family. After the Battle of Uhud in 625, he threw out the Banu Nadir family, Jewish family. And then after the Battle of the Trenches in 627, he then took all 800 men. He took all 800 men and he slit their throats and put them into pits where then they all died. Some of them very quickly, others slowly. Those who criticized him, Asma bint Marwan is probably the most famous, this poetess who wrote poetry against him when he moved to Medina in 622, and he had her killed. Umar, the blind disciple, went and killed her that night, stabbing her through the chest. About 25 people were assassinated, and their crime was that they critiqued Muhammad. They criticized Muhammad publicly. With these scriptures and the example of the Prophet Muhammad, can you then understand why so many within Islam today are saying what they are saying and doing what they are doing? Their authority, they believe, is that of Holy Writ, a divine authority modeled by the greatest and clearest paradigm for mankind, for all peoples, all places, and for all times, including Iraq and Syria, and I would say also Afghanistan. So what about Afghanistan? Let's move to Afghanistan. We're going to be commemorating 20 years where this group of Al-Qaedas, these 19 young men who came from Afghanistan, and they flew those 4 jets, 2 into the World Trade Center, 1 into the Pentagon, and 1 was brought down in Pennsylvania, in Western Pennsylvania. Where did this group originate? Now, to understand the Taliban, we need to do another history lesson. Excuse me, I love history lessons, but let's just go through because that'll help you understand better as to where they originated, who they are. And we need to see who the Pashtuns are, because it's the Pashtuns who were and are the Taliban. And to understand the Pashtuns, you need to look at this map. This is a map that shows you the border of Afghanistan, which was created in 1893 in a mapping office in London by a British military man named Sir Mortimer Durand. So it's called the Durand Line. And he used ridges and rivers to make that line, make that border. And you can see it cuts off the Pashtuns from Pakistan and the Pashtuns from Afghanistan. Half the tribe was left in Pakistan. It was India at that time. And half the tribe was left in Afghanistan. He wasn't interested at all in looking at tribal groups. He just wanted to find a good line on mountains and streams. That's why he cut the Pashtuns completely in half. Remember that orange spot, because that's going to come into play when we talk about the Taliban. When you look at Afghanistan today, that's what you see. And you notice there's different colors there for a reason. On the yellow, that would be the Tajiks, who you can see Tajikistan be above them. The pink is the Uzbekis, from Uzbekistan straight above them. And the green are the Hazaras. In the brown are the Chahar Aimak, and then the blue, that's the biggest group, and they're the ones that are by far the strongest of all these groups are the Pashtuns. They're the Pashtuns. They're the northern half of the Pashtuns, and they are the ones that are causing all the problem. Now, the Soviets came and they controlled Afghanistan from 1978 to 1992. They were finally thrown out, and they finally had to leave in 1992. But from 1992, there was a civil war between the competing warlords. The warlords each represent the different tribal interests. So you have the Uzbekis and the Tajiks and the Baluchis and also the Turkmen and the Hazaras, and especially the Pashtuns, who were vying for control over that country, because that country is made up of so many of these tribal groups. So what about the Taliban then? So where did they come out of all this? To do that, we need to look at, to understand that, we need to look at this character right here. This is the guy that started the Taliban. His name is Mullah Muhammad Omar, or someone just called Mullah Omar. That's usually his usual name. There he is as a young man in a colored photo, and this is what he looked like when he started the Taliban in 1994. He was living in Kandahar, and he was upset and infuriated by what was happening in the civil war. He was realizing that there was all these different tribal groups, and that he, as a Pashtun, was incensed that they were not really interested in the people or in the country. They were just interested in themselves. Each warlord wanted to have dominance. So therefore, he created the Taliban. Now, who are the Taliban? Well, they are the Talibans. He had 50 students. That's it. He only had 50 students who are his students called Talibans, and he created the Taliban with them in 1994. Almost immediately, the word got down to Pakistan, to these madrasas. Remember these madrasas I talked about earlier? That were started by the Deobandi movement. They were a very radical group that had believed in the Book of the Man, Book of the Man, Book of the Man. Maududi was their teacher. And the Jamaat-e-Islami was the group that created these madrasas. And there's millions of them now who are being graduated. Well, back there in 1994, they came across the border and they joined the Taliban there in Kandahar. And they just started moving right up through all over the northern parts, and they started taking over the Uzbekis and the Tajiks. They finally in 1996, they took over Kabul, and they just eradicated anybody in their way. So from 1996, the Taliban then controlled all of Afghanistan, and they continued to control Afghanistan for 5 years, up until 2001. Meanwhile, while they were doing that, they invited Al-Qaeda, who was having problems. Ayman Zawahiri and Osama bin Ladin were living in the Sudan, and they were not getting any help from anybody. And Osama bin Ladin went to Saudi Arabia to help them. He said, I would love to help you out. He was rebuffed by the Saudi Arabians, his own country. So he was infuriated by the rebuffing. And so the Taliban then motioned them to come on over to Afghanistan. In fact, it was the only country he could go to. So Osama bin Laden came to Afghanistan, then was joined by Ayman Zawahiri. Ayman Zawahiri then was a much more adept man. Osama bin Laden, really, to be fair, Osama bin Laden was nothing more than a playboy from a very wealthy family, the bin Laden family. You build a lot of these skyscrapers you see all over the Middle East, especially in Dubai, and you can see these. He had multi-million dollars worth of goods. And so he went to Afghanistan very shy, didn't know much, didn't know the Islam very much. He didn't even know how to hold a gun. And the first time he held a gun and shot it, it made him jump, from what he understood. But what he did is he brought a lot of this building equipment from his family, and he brought them to Afghanistan, and he started carving out these huge, enormous tunnels. And it was these tunnels that actually they became like the headquarters for many of the Taliban. Zawahiri came and joined him then, and Zawahiri did know the Quran, did understand theology, was much more adept, and was very powerful because he'd been very powerful in Egypt, and he had been studied under Said Qutb and Hassan al-Banna. So he was one of the best. And so when he joined with Osama bin Laden, he gave an awful lot of authority to Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden was quiet and meek and mild, and had a great smile, but didn't know much theology. But he loved Ayman Zawahiri, and the two of them were a perfect match. Now, what's interesting is Osama bin Laden was then killed on May 2nd, 2011. You all know the story, in Abbottabad, there in Pakistan, watching television, basically, he was just become a recluse in that room. Ayman Zawahiri has not been killed, and he's still alive today. And some people think in the last 2 or 3 weeks, he's now returned from Pakistan, where he was living, and he's returned to Afghanistan. Hugely important because of his influence, because all the way through, Al-Qaeda have been influential because of mainly Ayman Zawahiri, who's come out of the Muslim Brotherhood there in Egypt. So why did the US fail so miserably? Why in the world did they do such a terrible job? Well, I think the main reason is because look why they went to Afghanistan. There was nothing strategically important about Afghanistan. We can understand why the Russians went to Afghanistan because they're right next to Afghanistan in the north. That is their southern border. They needed a buffer place from all this radicalization going on in Pakistan and amongst the Pashtun. And that's why they wanted to take over Afghanistan so they could have a buffer against this radicalization that's percolating there in the southern parts of Afghanistan and the northern parts of Pakistan. That made sense, but they only lasted from 78 to 92. So they only lasted 14 years. The US, therefore, only went to Afghanistan not because of any strategic reason. They went really out of revenge. They wanted to revenge 9/11. That's why we just went in willy-nilly and destroyed, conquered the Taliban, took over Afghanistan. It was easy to do because that really all we had to do was shut down the Taliban, who were not doing that well anyways because of the fact that they don't know how to run schools. They don't know how to run cities. They're not from the urban areas. They are from the hills, the mountains. And so what did the Americans do? They got their revenge. But they didn't get Osama bin Ladin. They didn't get Ayman Zawahiri for one very simple reason. They just melted across the border down into Pakistan. One of the advantages, if you draw a line right through the Pashtun and the Pashtun on either side of the border, you can go back and forth over the border quite easily and nobody can stop you. No one will stop you because there's both groups the same group on both sides. So what did they do? Well, once they finally did get Osama bin Laden in 2011, that's when they should have gone out. But by that time, they stayed around to nation build. And that's what the whole big term was. We are going to nation build. We are going to make this country a Western country, bring it into the West, kicking and screaming into the West, which is America loves to do. And we love to do this everywhere. We want to make them democratic. And so we built hospitals and we built schools and we brought in businesses and we made businessmen and we freed up the women to go to the schools and freed up the women to get into government and freed up the women to get into the businesses. And we are creating Afghanistan in our own image. We created the largest standing army Afghanistan has ever seen. 300,000 men, at least a few weeks ago, up until August 15th. We have 300,000 men. That's just 3 weeks ago, folks. Goodness sakes, nothing in the history of Afghanistan has seen something that beautiful, that great. And we were patting ourselves on the back. Then Trump comes to his presidency and he says, we need to get out because everybody, once we had got Osama bin Laden, end of story, mission accomplished. Why are we in Afghanistan? So from 2011 for the last 10 years, every president since then has said, we're getting out of Afghanistan. We're getting out of Afghanistan because this is bleeding us. And we're tired of seeing body bags because we were in the south while all the Europeans were in the north, the easy areas, in the Uzbeki areas, in the Tajik areas. Only the British and the Americans were in the Pashtun areas, in Lashkar and in Kandahar and in Kabul and in Jalalabad. That's why the Americans wanted to get out, because we were bleeding. Soldiers were coming back in body bags, and there was no reason to stay anymore. Revenge had been accomplished. After 2011, there was no reason to stay, but because of our conscience and because we wanted to do well, we wanted to nation build. And so we created this huge army, 300,000. Where did they come from? Because that army just gave up. In 10 days, everything came apart. In 10 days, between August 5th and August 15th, last month, August 5th and August 15th, 10 days, 20 years was destroyed. You all saw the pictures. I don't have to tell you what happened. Thousands of people rushed to the airport. They tried to get on those planes. Some young men, some boys grabbed onto the wheels and they took off with the planes and their bodies fell to the ground. You could see the videos of them falling to the ground and they were killed. What desperation? What in the world would give that kind of desperation? Well, they had been seduced by the Americans. They had been seduced with hospitals and schools and businesses and freedoms that they'd never seen before. And they wanted those freedoms. And suddenly they found out that these Taliban, now for 10 days, they had been watching and hearing. We watched, we heard, we saw how that the Taliban, the first thing they did, they went up to the north. They went up to the north. And what did they do? They went up to the north and they took over Mazar-e-Sharif. That was genius because that means they took over an area that they were not even a stronghold. not one of their strongholds. They went over to the west, over here, and they took over Herat. And they went over to the east and took over Jalalabad. And then they took Kandahar in the south. So they took the major cities, the 4 major cities. All they had left was Kabul. And they just walked right into Kabul. And in almost all these areas, there was no fight. There was no battles. They just walked in. They really just walked in, especially in Kabul. They just walked into the presidential palace, and then they just took over. And you can see the picture, them sitting there, they're standing there, they're just looking kind of befuddled. They don't know what to do. They didn't even look in place. There's this beautiful desk, and here they are. They're just looking everywhere, and they have, look what they're holding. Look what they're holding. They're holding M16s. Those are American weapons. Those are American weapons. What had happened? Well, everywhere they went, this 300,000 soldiers just took off their uniforms, put on civilian dress, and handed them their weapons. Why did they hand them their weapons? Because the US, for 20 years, really only controlled the cities. They only controlled the cities. They controlled, looking from your perspective, Kabul, Mazar-e-Sharif, Herat, Kandahar, Jalalabad, and Lashkar-Gah. That's Lashkar-Gah. That's where the British controlled. Really, that's all they controlled, the 5 cities. They didn't control the countryside. They didn't control the mountainous areas. They didn't control the villages. They didn't control the rural area. And 80% of all Afghanis live in the rural area. Only 20% live in the cities. Only 20%. And it was that 20% that they had given all these freedoms to. And they had seduced them with all these trinkets and all this money, enormous. $2 trillion pumped into the economy. $2 trillion by America alone. All the other Europeans had many other millions and millions of dollars. But $2 trillion were pumped into the economy there. But they pumped them into the cities. That's why the Taliban just took over one city after another, boom, 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 until finally Kabul was taken on August 15th. Why? Because the military had relatives who were in those villages, who were under the Taliban rule. And they knew they liked being soldiers. They got uniforms, they got houses, they got fed, they got salaries. Who wouldn't get a job like that? But as soon as they saw all these cities falling from August 5th to August 15th, they just gave their weapons up and they let them come in to they let them come in to the big bases. Bagram base, one of the largest bases, Air Force bases in the world. They just gave up the base with all these airplanes, 27 airplanes. Now, they have been disabled, of course. Well, once the US left, so did their nation building. Everybody tried to leave with them. 126,000 we managed to get out. Biden patted himself on his back, saying, mission accomplished, he said. We got ourselves out of there. What a fiasco. I'm sure he's going to rue how he did that. And it's been an embarrassment. Take a look at those 5 cities. Just take a look at them. Mazar-e-Sharif, Herat, Kandahar, Kabul, and Jalalabad. Those are the cities. That's the only area that the Americans really controlled, and the British. They didn't control anything else. And that's why we lost in 10 days what we had created over 20 years. So what's about the future? What about the future? To understand the Taliban, one must understand the Pashtuns. This is why we need to look at the future. For 2,000 years, the Pashtuns have lived in that part of the world. So they can trace their lineage all the way back to the 1st century BC. And they've lived under what they call a code of ethics called Pashtunwali. Now, there are many parts of the Pashtunwali, but the most important areas are the 4 that I have up there. You have Melmestya, which means being a good host to those who come in from outside. You have Nunawatai, which means giving asylum to anybody that comes, and you protect them if they come and they come under Melmestya. Probably remember the Navy SEAL when the Taliban attacked and killed. They ambushed a Navy SEAL group, and one of them got away, Marcus Luttrell, and he was wounded. The Sabrai tribe took him in, and they gave him Nunawatai, and he used that. And they even stood against other Taliban and actually had fights with the other Taliban just to protect it because of that Nunawatai. But they also then have Badal. Badal means vengeance against anybody that stands against, and that Badal can continue from generation to generation to generation. Another group of what they know as their code of ethics is Hewad, the country. The country is the most important thing. You must fight for the country. What country? Khorasan. Khorasan. There you can see. The Khorasan is that orange area there. That is the original area of the Pashtuns. And so the Pashtuns want to take that all back, which means they want to take part of Pakistan back. Pakistan is going to have a terrible future because they have not really taken this into consideration. They want to take back Khorasan. Why? Because that is their country, Hewad, and they want vengeance. Now, what about the people left behind? No, you saw what happened. Many who tried to get on those planes, 126,000 that succeeded. Tens of thousands of Afghans still are there who work for the US and their allies, left behind, possibly will be hunted down. We don't know. We're guessing that that's what's going to happen. We'll see. What's more important is what's been happening in the last 2 years. There has been a devastating famine in Afghanistan, and that 70% of the Afghani populace cannot even feed themselves, and they have to be fed. And they were being fed by the NGOs, the European NGOs and the American NGOs who've been feeding them. Now, all of those NGOs were thrown out within 2 weeks. After August 15th, they all had to left. They are part of the 126,000 that left, and the other tens of thousands that left for the other countries. They're no longer in Afghanistan. And it is those NGOs that had all the food to feed the people. It has those NGOs that had all the contacts and had all the means to get them to the people. The Taliban don't know how to feed people. They're not interested. That is not, they're going to have to, but they don't have any experience. They don't have any engineering experience. They don't have any technical experience. They don't have any political will, and they don't have any background in agriculture on that scale. So who's going to now feed them? And what's going to happen about this famine? See, no one talked about that. I don't see anybody talking about that. I don't see Biden talking about it. I don't see American pundits talking about it. I don't even see the news talking about it. And then what about the Christian church? See, this is what we need to be careful of, because we have lots of Christian brothers and sisters that are still in Afghanistan who are under persecution. We heard tonight from one young lady whose family was able to get out on that rush to get out. And even she said that it was difficult for them in Doha. Even as they're in the United States, there's a lot of difficulty, but they're glad to get out. What about those left behind? What about the churches that are underground? We're getting in reports now. We know that some pastors were able to go down to the land, to the land borders crossings in Quetta, which is in the south, and Peshawar, which is up in the east. Peshawar up here, Quetta down here. So they have been getting out, but the majority of pastors have chosen to stay put, to help their churches, to help their congregants. They don't want to leave their churches. What we're hearing is a number of pastors are having to move from house to house to house every night because their neighbors are pointing them out, are filching on them to the Taliban. And the Taliban are coming with lists of their names. Where did they get that list from? How did they get their names? Somebody has basically told the Taliban who the pastors are. We need to pray for the church and for the people of Afghanistan, as the future does not look good. Is there a solution to this? And this is what George wanted me to ask. Come up with a solution, Jay. Well, most people, when you ask this, say, well, that basically this is not a solution that the church can do. This is a solution that the state must do. It's the state's duty. Certainly, it can protect or fight against this real evil, this radicalism. But in Afghanistan, they had 20 years to do so, and it all came to naught in 10 days. So it's obviously the state is not capable of eradicating radicalism, not in Afghanistan. We did it okay in Syria, but not in Afghanistan. Nation building is what they want to do, but not on the back of bombs, bullets, and cruise missiles. And that's not a final solution, especially in Afghanistan, because Afghanistan is a mountainous country. It's not like the flat plains of Iraq and Syria, where aircraft can be used. So what is the remit of the state? What can they do? How can they try to solve this? The state is there to police, but can they understand religious ideology, which underpins everything radical Muslims believe, including the Taliban. No, they aren't. They are flummoxed at the extreme rage when Muhammad is insulted and struggle to understand why the Charlie Hebdo atrocities have happened. They can't understand even why the Charlie Hebdos was a problem. The state only can engage militarily, but it can't solve the ideological problem. Because of the separation of church and state, when you look at that separation of church and state, the state doesn't even know how to deal with that, which is in the church, or in this case, the mosque. They don't understand the ideology, nor do they understand the theology of Islam, and they don't have the tools to confront it. Therefore, don't ask the state to do this. They're not going to be able to do that. Now, all they want is politicians, they can criticize, but they don't even want to criticize Islam's founder. They are scared to death of criticizing. I remember Tony Blair saying that he read the Quran all the way through 3 times, and all he could find is peace. Peace in the Quran. What Quran did he read? David Cameron, the UK Prime Minister, said ISIS has nothing to do with Islam, separating ISIS and separating Boko Haram and all these radical groups. Obama said much the same thing. ISIL, he called it, is not Islamic. And they need the votes of the minorities. They need the votes of the Muslims, and therefore they want to make sure that they speak for them and don't ever tarnish their constituents with the word radical. Christians, much of those are the same problem I find everywhere. All that Christians want are peace and making and peace and love. I just came out of Central America, and almost all the teaching that went before me was on peace and reconciliation with Islam, peace and reconciliation with Islam. And suddenly I said, well, wait, why are you so scared of the Muslims? Why don't we just take them on? Go to the same scriptures and unpack it and then show them how hopeless a Quran they have and how hopeless their Muhammad is and how hopeless Islam is historically. They never heard that before. I was the first that ever taught them that, because Christians don't know how to engage with Muslims theologically. We don't. If our goal is simply peace in with Islam and Muslims, it can become a blockage to turning radical hate to Taliban to radical love. Jesus. Remember what Jesus says. If the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. We should be expected to be hated, persecuted, jailed, flogged, even killed, if need be, if we are preaching Jesus' name and confronting Islam or any other ism, any other ideology that stands in the way of Jesus Christ. We should expect this. That's in chapter 10 of Matthew. It's right there. So who can, therefore, fight radical Islam? What about the atheists? Maybe they can do it. Well, look at Anne-Marie Waters, a good friend. Douglas Murray, another good friend. Tom Holland. Geert Wilders out of Holland. The other 3 are from Britain. They've tried their best. These are the best. The 4 of them I know in Europe. The 4 best in Europe that have been confronting Islam. But they have no solution for the Muslims. Oh, they can shut down Islam intellectually, but not ideologically, because they have no ideology to replace it, because they're atheists. What about the humanists? Well, usually they either respond 3 different ways: with rage, and they build division, and hate which leads to war. They keep on saying that. Do to them as they are doing to you, that's not a solution. Defiance. They defend secularism's God of liberty, but they don't even understand what that means or where it's coming from or the roots that it comes up. You can't even talk about that liberty unless you go to the Bible to find out how it's to be applied. They try to address the issues, but they don't even understand the religion they're trying to address. And then many of them, because out of frustration, they just end in fear. Pretend all's well. They worry, but they don't act. They blame all religions as equally guilty, and that's how they get around it. Well, we're all guilty, including our Christian background, our Judeo-Christian background. That is not a solution. What about the Islamic missionaries? Muslim missionaries, if you listen to them, and I have been listening to them for 30 years, I've had to engage with them face-to-face at Speaker's Corner for 25 years, and all they want to do is target the West. They just want to challenge Christianity. They're Muslim missionaries using Acts 17 missional methods to convert Christians, but their internet sites are all polemical. They're not even interested in the radical Muslims. They are only interested in attacking us as if we're the problem. Their tracts always blame Christianity for immorality, war, and materialism. They're missionaries. They never, ever target radical Muslims because, for one very good reason. They are fearful of radical Muslims. They would rather have nothing to do with them because they know that they cannot support what they say using scripture like the radical Muslims can. They never source the book of the man, the missionaries I come across. They always just look at all the problems, polemical, but they cannot at all use, they're hopeless when it comes to apologetics. That's why the radicals are so much more exciting to work with, because they can, and they do, and they always source what they say in scripture. What about moderate Muslims who live in the West? Bernard Haeckel, Princeton scholar, said this: moderate Muslims are embarrassed and politically correct with a cotton candy view of their own religion that neglects what their religion has historically and legally required. Many denials of the Islamic State's religious nature, he said, are rooted in an interfaith Christian nonsense tradition. So he gives no hope for the Muslim radical moderates who are here in the West. What about Christians? Among native Christians and Muslim immigrants in Western Europe, this was done in 2013, looking and questionnaire, looking and see how they sort what they believe. If you take a look at the orange versus the light cream color, the orange or the brown, I don't know what color you would call that, gold, let's call it gold, are the Christians returning to the roots. Only 20% of Christians return to the roots, whereas 58% of Muslims living in the West return to the roots. Believe that only one true and binding religion, 18% of Christians believe that there's one true and binding, whereas Muslims, 74% believe that there's only one religion, and that's Islam. That religious rules are more important than secular rules, only 12% of Christians believe that, whereas 65% of Muslims believe that here in the West. And those that agree with all three, only 3% of Christians, half of all Muslims agree with that. So you can see Muslims, whether they are radical, nominal, or liberal living in the West, have a much more radical view of their own religion and have a much stronger faith and defense of it than we do. So how has the church responded? Well, there's a number of things. Christian missionaries tend to respond either covertly or overtly. They tend to hide the truth. They tend to, even amongst our missionaries, they just don't understand this kind of Islam. They want an Islam that they can bring home to tea. They want an Islam that they don't have to argue with. They want an Islam where everybody will say yes, yes, yes to everything they say. Therefore, they're fearful to engage. And I found missionary after missionary and country after country where I go, they just don't know how to engage with Muslims. So they spend all their time hiding behind what I call friendship only model. They only want to make friends, find commonality, find things that they can find in common, which limits their opportunities. In fact, that usually becomes the goal, just making friends. They don't ever want to preach the gospel because they're so fearful they may offend the Muslims. They do not like public engagement. Strangely, believe me, it is unchristlike. I used to get that all the time. For 25 years in Britain, I used to be labeled I'm unchristlike because I was confronting Muslims at Speaker's Corner every Sunday and shutting them down on the Quran and shutting them down on Muhammad and shutting them down on their history. They hated that because they thought that was not what Christ did. So who has the solution to radical Islam? Not the atheists, not the Muslim missionaries, not the moderate Muslims. Certainly most Christians and not most missionaries I met don't have any solution, because how are you going to take on that ideology? Well, the only way I know how to take on radical Islam's ideology is with a radical Christian ideology. Radical Christianity is the only solution I can see for radical Islam. Romans 1:16, for I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation for everyone who believes. Remember, the Apostle Paul was a murderer of unbelievers before he met the Lord Jesus, after which he converted, transformed, and took the gospel to the very people that he was murdering. All nations. So look at some radical Christians. Well, these are the only ones I could find from Europe when I was there. Myself, Dr. Patrick Sogdale, and Sam Solomon. I looked and I tried to scour and try to say, who are the radical Christians that we're talking about who are engaging publicly with Islam? Dr. Patrick Sogdale, Sam Solomon, amazing characters, good friends of mine. And I would do it myself because I couldn't find anybody else in other countries who was actually publicly doing it. On this side of the Atlantic, but others that started coming along, like Beth Peltola, who used to be Beth Grove, Hatun Tosh, who you've been seeing all over the news in the last few months. Sarah Lumgar, those three were all on my team. And the only reason why they were so radical is because Fander was so radical. And Fander, who was our paradigm from the 1800s, we used him as our paradigm. And then we brought brought Dr. Jonathan McClatchy along, and he's now really moving right ahead in his debating experience and expertise with taking on Muslims right, left, and center. And the reason I think this new group coming out of the UK is because of our material, the Book and the Man. Others that have now come up who are even a newer group are people like Mel from Sneakers Corner, or Murad, who is also from Sneakers Corner. And Bob, actually, he's actually Middle Eastern, but he works out of Sneakers Corner, which is European. Bob the Builder, an amazing character. He's kind of just taken over my an awful lot of my bombastic ability that he's now there at Speaker's Corner with Soko Films. And then Kate, who is doing a great job there also on Soko Films. Here in the US, well, there are the big four right there. David Wood, Sam Shamoun, Al-Fadi, and Osama bin Ladin. I'm sure I'm missing some. There may be some others, but these are the big four that I think of are the ones that are really engaging public with Islam. Maybe Al-Fadi not as much. He's not that in that bombastic. He does more of an interview style. But certainly David Wood and Sam Shamoun and Osama bin Ladin, you can't stop these guys. And they're able to do that on the internet, and they're having a huge influence all over the world. Others who are engaging, well, I put myself there now that I'm here in the United States. And then, of course, Colin coming out of Islamic Critiqued. And then Christian Prince, who no one knows who he is. We just love his voice, and we love what he's doing. He lives here in the States, but I don't know where. Don't ask me anymore. And then, of course, Anthony Rogers, our good friend, who is here at this conference and is doing such a great job on his channel. And he's doing such an amazing job, theologically speaking, really taking on the best and the brightest and just impacting, I think, theologically speaking, on the Trinity, on the divinity of Jesus, authority of Scripture, you name it, he's doing it. He's one of the great ones coming up. And look out for him. You'll see more and more from Anthony Rogers. Others, Tony Costa, Nabil Qureshi, he's now deceased, but he has been such an influence with his writing. Tony Costa, Dr. Tony Costa, who's out of Toronto, just amazing what he is doing. And what I love about him, he's such a passive, easygoing type of character, but what he says is absolutely devastating. Mary Jo White out of Dallas, and she has been doing some great debates. And then, of course, Samuel Green, a friend for many, many years coming out of Australia, who's done a great job there in debating and also just taking on Muslims all over the world. He's trying to make sure that he debates all the best debaters, and he lives there in Hobart, Tasmania. Dr. Bernie Power, what a friend in Australia, doing debates. Even at his age, he just cannot shut this guy down. He's so prolific and such an amazing debater. Others in Africa and Asia, John Gilchrist, who is a guy that really influenced me in my earlier years. He's still going at it. He's a lawyer there in South Africa. Brian Marion, who's one of those he's trained up there in South Africa. Brian Thomas from Mumbai and Narendra Sahu, both from Mumbai. These guys are debating not only Muslims, they're debating Hindus, you name it, they're debating. These guys are amazing debaters. And then, of course, Tamil Joshua, who destroyed there in Tamil, one of the most influential Muslim clerics, just in one debate, using historical criticism, all in Tamil. Asghar Ali coming out of Bangalore, just an enormous amount of charisma this guy has. These guys are amazing, and they're doing a much better job than almost anybody else I know, because they're Indians, and I won't explain that. Ask me if you have another time. So what's the solution? And I'm going to end with this. The reason why we're starting to get radical Muslim Christians who are now going public and doing such a great job is because we have the material now. We have such good material. When you look at the Bible versus the Quran, we can destroy the Quran. We have a solid history. Islam has almost no history, or the Quran has no history. The kingdom of God versus the Khilafah. Look at the kingdom of God. It wins every time against the Khilafah. Just take a look and see where the kingdom of God has flourished all through the West, and why we in the West are so dependent on Judeo-Christian kingdom of God. That is what made West so great. And that's why so many people want to come our direction and live in the West, because of the kingdom of God that we have. No, I'm not saying America is the kingdom of God. I'm saying our principles, Judeo-Christian principles that create our laws and institutions. That is what has made us great, all based on the Bible. The Khilafah, show me one Khilafah that has been successful. None. The women in the Bible versus women in the Quran, this is something that Beth Patola has really done such a great job on, and she got her master's in this area. She's done an amazing job of just looking at the women in both the Bible and the Quran and showing that it's so much more freeing for her as a woman, looking at the Bible, than what we find in the Quran. Jesus versus Muhammad. I mean, goodness sakes, if you look at Jesus, Muhammad, Jesus wins every time. Jesus, what a model for today, for any day, for anyone, for anywhere. And then, of course, Yahweh versus Allah. There's no contest. Yahweh just destroys Allah. Everybody falls in love with Yahweh and in Jesus. Allah, please, give me an hour and I'll tell you all the problems I have with Allah. And when you look at peace versus violence, it is peace in Christianity that has been consistent for the last 2,000 years versus violence in Islam. Now, I'm not saying all of the church has been peaceful, but the whole ethos of peace, you can only find in the New Testament. You can only find in the person of Jesus Christ. You can only find in his example. And that's why the peace of Jesus Christ in the Gospels is the standard that we're using today. You take a look at Islam. And as I said already, just look at the verses, look at the man, look at the book of the man, look at the book of the man of Islam. And you will see there's violence throughout. Which then, if you look at the relevancy of Christianity, in looking at all these areas, which is the most relevant? When you look at the Bible, the kingdom of God, the women of the Bible, Jesus, Yahweh, and the peace of Christianity, obviously it is Christianity that's a lot more relevant against the irrelevancy of the Quran, the Khilafah, women in the Quran, Muhammad, Allah, and violence in Islam. None of that is irrelevant, not for the day, not for any day, not for here, not for anywhere. And that's why I would suggest not for you, not for me, or for anyone. We have the solution. What weapons will we use? The weapons we use are not weapons of this world. For we do not use weapons of this world. For the weapons of our warfare are not of flesh and blood, but have divine power to destroy strongholds. It says in 2 Corinthians 10, verse 4. And then verse 5, we destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God. And we take every thought and make it captive to and obedient to Jesus Christ. It is arguments that we use, folks. We have the ideology and we have the scriptures. We have the only solution for today. Now, for those of you who are going to go out into the world and use this material, remember the Taliban are still there. And the Taliban have now thrown United States out. Yes, they have. But what are they going to replace it with? And for any of you who are part of the Taliban, or any of you who are Muslims who are looking at the Taliban and are starting to ballyhoo and say, yay, look at the Taliban, they destroyed America. Do you really want to live in that type of environment? Do you want to go back to Afghanistan? Do any of you want to go back? What about the tens of thousands that wanted to leave, that still want to leave? What is it about what America tried to do in nation building there that was correct? And what is it about many of you who have come to the West, including many of you who are watching right now, who are living in the West, who are living here in the United States and living in Europe, and you're living in the West because of something about the West that attracts you? And it's not just the economy, or you might say, if it is the economy, why is the economy so good here? Now, I've always asked this question. Muslims say, well, because we have evil people in in Muslim countries who are always corrupt. Well, why is it that we don't have that corruption here? What's so different about Western economy? What about the culture? Why is our culture so attractive to you if you come from Islam? Why aren't you going to Islamic? Why did all those tens of thousands of people who try to jump on those planes, and there are 126,000 who got onto those planes, why did they all come to the US? Why didn't they go to Saudi Arabia? Why didn't they go to Pakistan right south of them? Why didn't they go to any other Muslim country? And why did they all want to come to America and to Britain and to Norway and to Germany and to all these other countries in Europe? None of them wanted to go to Muslim countries. Well, I shouldn't say none. Maybe there were a few. The vast majority wanted to come to our countries. Culturally speaking, that doesn't make sense. What about politics? If you really believe politics is the problem, then why don't you go to a political country that is like you? Why don't you go to Saudi Arabia, where it is based on a theocratic state? That's the best theocratic state. Well, better yet, now that Afghanistan is ruled by a theocratic political power, the Taliban, they are theocratic. Everything is hierarchical. Allah at the top, the ulama underneath, the ummah, the believers. The ulama are the religious leaders. Then they call the ummah. Then underneath that come the al-kitab, that's us. And then at the very bottom, the kafirs. You see what they're doing to the kafirs. You see what they're doing to the al-kitab. They're killing us. They're killing us. If you really like it so much, if you really think Islam is the answer, go to Afghanistan now. It's open now. It's an Islamic state. It is perfect for you. You can now just immigrate back there. But you're not going to. No, you're not going to. Because you've been seduced by the West. There's something about the West that seduced you, isn't it? There's something about the West that really has attracted you to make you want to come here. Well, let me tell you what you've come to. You've come to freedoms that you got used to. The few of you who were in Afghanistan who saw those freedoms for 20 years, you've come to those freedoms and you like those freedoms. The freedom of expression, the freedom for women to go into the workplace, the freedom to be educated, women to be educated alongside men, the freedom to have a voice in politics, the freedom, yes, to even move and immigrate, and the freedom to even leave your religion if you want to. The choices you have that we have in the West are all based on biblical, Judeo-Christian ideology. So when you come to the West, realize you're moving into now those freedoms again. And those freedoms took thousands of years to gain, all based on the person of Jesus Christ. I could go on and on about Jesus Christ. If you really do not want to go back to Afghanistan, which most of you, I'm sure you don't want to, then don't bring Afghanistan here. And don't bring the Taliban here. We don't need any more Sharia law. We don't need any more failed states, any more failed institutions, any more failed people, any more failed structures of immorality. We don't need that here, folks. One of the beauties of the West, based on Judeo-Christian principles, is that we have the freedom to vote, we have the freedom of movement, we have the freedom of speech, and we have the freedom of expression, and even the freedom of choice. All these freedoms is why you've come. All these freedoms is what you love about the United States and about Europe and all the other countries that have been in your country now for those of you who are in Afghanistan for 20 years and helped you to see what those freedoms were like. We tried to do nation building. That was not the right way to do it. Obviously, we didn't succeed. But now you're here. And I would suggest that you stop going to this book anymore. It has not succeeded. And it's not going to succeed in Afghanistan. And come back to this book. Come back to the real foundation for freedom and love. And yes, mercy and compassion. And that's the person of Jesus Christ. That's my solution. You really want a solution? It's right here in this book, modeled by the man, the book and the man, the book and the man. What's the book? The Bible. Who's the man? Jesus Christ. He's the man for today, for every day. He's the man for you. He's the man for me. He's the man for everywhere. God bless you. It's been going good being with you. I know I've gone a little bit long, but I hope you realize that if you want to have tea with the Taliban, be careful, because the tea with the Taliban, you might actually get you under their grip and under their control. Why don't you come back and have tea with us? It's a better tea. It's a lot more fruitful. And it's based on everything we know on this book. God bless you. This is Jay. Over and out.